283 passengers, including 80 children and 15 crew members, were on board the Malaysian Airlines MH17. It started out as a normal flight, not a single thing out of place. All passengers and crew staff were relaxed as they flew about 30,000 feet above the grounds of eastern Ukraine. Little did they know that in just a few moments, their aircraft would be hit with something deadly, breaking off the airplane into multiple pieces and ending the lives of every single living thing on board. This is the story of Malaysia Airlines MH17 and the unforeseen tragedy that befell them and took the entire aviation world by storm.
There is no other way to describe what's happening tonight.
And as we mentioned, 3 of them were infants.
Malaysia 17 came from many nations.
Was apparently shot down over his country.
However, to fully understand how these all played out, a short history lesson is in order. The day was the 12th of April 2014. It all started when a 50-man commando unit headed by Russian citizen Igor Girkin seized Sloviansk in Donetsk Oblast. The Ukrainian military launched an operation against them in response, and just like that, a devastating war was afoot, claiming thousands of lives and getting more and more heated by the day. But there was an eventual silver lining. In September 2014, Ukraine, Russia, and separatist groups from Donetsk and Luhansk agreed to a ceasefire called the Minsk Protocol. This was supposed to bring some semblance of peace for a little while. Sadly, though, the peace didn't hold, and fighting broke out again in January 2015, with the separatists seizing control of Donetsk airport, and now the war was afoot again, more heated and deadlier than the last. Now this is where it gets a little interesting. Another ceasefire, known as Minsk II, was established on February 12, 2015. This time, they'd have learned their lesson and actually stopped the war for a little while, right? Well, wrong. Just after said ceasefire, the separatists launched an attack on Debaltseve, forcing Ukrainian forces to retreat. Following the fall of Debaltseve, the conflict settled into a stalemate, with both sides digging trenches and building bunkers and tunnels. This resulted in a static warfare resembling trench warfare from earlier conflicts. Although the fighting had slowed down, it didn't stop completely, earning the conflict the label of a frozen conflict. Nonetheless, the region remained dangerous, with casualties occurring regularly. Now, at this point, you're probably asking yourself what this war had to do with the MH17 Malaysian aircraft. Well, the answer to that is everything, as you are about to find out in a bit. On the 17th of July 2014, the Malaysian flight was scheduled to take its normal route from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport to Kuala Lumpur International Airport. They were supposed to leave at 10:31 GMT and arrive at their destination at 22:10 GMT. But little did they know that just a few hours into their flight, something horrible awaited them. Made up of about 15 crew members and 283 passengers, the staff were all from Malaysia, while the majority of the passengers were from the Netherlands. The others were from either Malaysia or Australia, with a smaller number from 7 other countries. Therefore, it was safe to say that about 10 countries were represented in the passengers of the flight. When it was time to board, none was the wiser that they would all soon be reported in the national news. They boarded the aircraft, sat back, and relaxed for the 2.5-hour journey before them. However, among the passengers were individuals heading to the 20th International AIDS Conference in Melbourne, including Joop Lang, who was a former president of the International AIDS Society, the organization behind the conference. Soon, all the people on board would cease to exist due to a singular action that had nothing to do with them. When you hear of aircraft tragedy strikes and passengers losing their lives, one would naturally think a mistake was made somewhere. Perhaps it was an oversight of the engineers before the flight started, or the crew did something wrong, that alongside bad weather and bad communication. But what if I told you that this aircraft was somewhat different? What if I told you that the crew did every single thing right, but were the first to lose their lives? So how did it all happen? Well, a few hours into the flight, the pilots did all that was required of them. They maintained regular communication with air traffic control and also stayed on the prescribed altitude range, which was 30,000 feet above ground. However, as the flight progressed, almost as though they sensed what was coming, they asked traffic control if it was okay for them to ascend even higher to 34,000 feet, just in case. But they were denied and so maintained their cruising altitude in line with instructions. And just when they had let their guard down, something unexpected happened. This is where the story takes a dark turn. At about 16:20 local time, just when the plane was flying over eastern Ukraine, from almost nowhere, pilots noticed something heading for their aircraft at a dangerously fast speed. "What's that?" they asked each other. They had no time to think, no time to debate, no time to even make a move. The thing hit the aircraft in less than 5 seconds, and that was the beginning of the end. What those in the aircraft didn't know was that the object was a surface-to-air missile known as a buck missile, and it was fired from an area southeast of the airplane. It exploded outside the aircraft, just above and to the left of the cockpit, causing a devastating explosion that sent fragments from the missile all around, and there was severe damage to the cockpit. The 3 members in the cockpit stood no chance. In that split second, they all lost their lives as the airplane tore apart into different pieces. The damage, even mid-air, was both horrific and dramatic, and what you are about to hear are the horrors that the aircraft went through before finally hitting the ground. Brace yourself. It all started with a missile exploding near the plane, sending pieces flying everywhere. These bits smashed into the front of the plane where the cockpit is, and sadly, the crew in there didn't make it. Because of all this damage, the front part of the plane broke off from the rest. As if that wasn't bad enough, things got worse. The wings, those pointy parts on the sides, broke off next, and then the back part of the plane, including the tail, followed suit. With each piece breaking off, the plane got wobblier and wobblier. As bad as that all seems, it gets even worse. Eventually, the main part of the plane just couldn't stay up anymore. It started falling fast, flipping over in the air, and hurling the hundreds of passengers along with it. Some got squashed in by the metals of the plane, others got cut into with shrapnel, but the ones who escaped this fate were flung out the plane by gravity and forced to endure a horrific end. The atmosphere in the aircraft was one of desperation, fear, and distress. Everyone, as they fought for their lives, knew that there was a good chance they wouldn't make it out of this alive. Finally, the airplane hit the ground in a horrible crash, turning upside down. When it crashed, it broke into even more pieces, scattering within a 20-mile radius. Just like that, everyone on board was no more. Men, women, children, crew members, all with family and friends waiting for them to come back home. Their lives had been prematurely cut short, and they had met their end. Later on, when investigators looked into what happened, they figured out from the time the cockpit broke off to when the rest of the plane hit the ground, it was only about a minute or so. During this minute, the plane was all over the place, a full minute of uproar, fear, distress, and pain. It must have been the longest 1 minute of all of their lives, and sadly, it didn't end well. The Dutch authorities, concerned about finding the truth, asked for investigations from 3 groups: Dutch, Russian, and Ukrainian. They wanted to determine where the missile launcher might have been when it fired. These investigations suggested that the missile could have come from about 320 square kilometers in eastern Ukraine. But that was just a theory. They needed to be sure. The joint investigation team and the Ukrainian government believed that the missile came from Russia and was launched from the part of eastern Ukraine controlled by the rebels. In June 2016, the JIT shared a photo of a big missile part found at the crash site, which was identified as Russian-made.
We're going to request more countries for assistance. There are more countries who have weapon experts also on these systems, but also Russia. They already said to us that they wanted to help us.
More and more investigations were carried out, and all the authorities involved were dogged about the same thing: getting to the bottom of who fired the missile. Finally, by September 2016, the team had gathered evidence from witnesses, phone calls, photos, and satellite images. They concluded that the missile was fired from high ground in a place called Pervomaisky, near Snez, in territory held by pro-Russian separatists. They also tracked the path of the missile launcher from Russia to the launch site and back into Russian territory right after the plane was shot down. In 2018, Dutch investigators determined that the missile belonged to a Russian brigade called the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, based in Kursk. They were proud of themselves, they had finally gotten to the bottom of the case, and it was safe to announce that Russia was behind the attacks. But little did they know they were in for the shock of their lives. Russia's defense ministry denied the accusations, saying their weapons weren't involved in the crash. Was this true, or just a shady attempt to save face? It's hard to tell. However, the international investigators found that all the vehicles in the convoy carrying the missile were from the Russian armed forces. Based on the findings, the Netherlands and Australia pointed the finger at Russia, blaming them for deploying the missile launcher that shot down MH17. And so a whole back and forth ensued. On one hand, investigators asked Russia to cooperate fully with the investigation. Russia claimed it had evidence that the missile came from Ukrainian-held territory, pushing the blame on Ukraine. The investigators said they would review any evidence Russia provided. But eventually, the task force drew up a list of 100 possible suspects, including 4 men named in June 2019. On June 19, 2019, the Dutch authorities officially accused 4 individuals of murder related to the plane crash. 3 Russians named Igor Girkin, Sergei Dubinsky, and Oleg Pulatov, and 1 Ukrainian named Leonid Kurchenko. The authorities even issued international arrest warrants for each of them. But watch how dramatic this later got. One of the suspects, Lieutenant Colonel Oleg Pulatov, said he wanted to be part of the legal process and have his say in court. Well, it was his right and everyone had to respect it. So the trial started in the Hague's District Court on March 9, 2020, but interestingly enough, none of the accused showed up. But it gets even more dramatic. Igor Girkin, one of the accused Russians, talked to journalist Graham Phillips and said he wouldn't attend the trial because he didn't think the court had the right to judge Russian citizens. He also claimed he had nothing to do with the plane being shot down. Instead, he blamed the Ukrainian government, suggesting they were responsible for sending an airplane into a dangerous area. So at the end of the day, who should we really believe? Who was really responsible for shooting down the Malaysian aircraft MH17? After the tragic crash, people all over the world came together to remember and honor the lives lost. In Australia and the Netherlands, special memorial services were organized. As a matter of fact, in the Netherlands, July 23rd became a national day of mourning, the first time this has happened since 1962. In Australia, heartfelt gatherings took place to pay respects to those who perished. The AIDS 2014 conference, which had several delegates on Flight MH17, started with a touching tribute to the crash victims. It was a poignant reminder of the loss felt by many communities worldwide. But Australia and the Netherlands were not the only ones paying their respects. In Malaysia, people in Kuala Lumpur created impromptu memorials to honor the memory of those on board the flight. To most who heard about this tragic incident, the people on board were just known as passengers, but they were human beings, people with interests, hobbies, businesses, and families. For instance, among the passengers were avid supporters of Newcastle United Football Club, John Alder and Liam Sweeney, who were heading to watch their team play in New Zealand. When the football club heard about this, they paid tribute to them, and a special memorial garden was established outside their stadium to remember not only Alder and Sweeney, but all the victims of the tragedy. But that was not all. 3 years after the crash, on July 17, 2017, a solemn memorial was unveiled in Vijhuizen, the Netherlands, close to Schiphol Airport. This memorial, attended by over 2,000 relatives of the victims, includes 298 trees, one for each person lost in the tragedy. In a heartfelt gesture, sunflower seeds taken from a field near the crash site were grown in remembrance of the 15 residents of Hilversum, including 3 families who lost their lives. Additionally, Fairfax chief correspondent Paul McGuff and photographer Kate Garrity collected sunflower seeds from the wreckage site as a keepsake for the families and friends of the 38 Australian victims. These seeds unexpectedly germinated, serving as a symbol of hope and resilience amid the sorrow.